Sleepy Hollow and Tarrytown, nestled in the scenic Hudson Valley of New York, are steeped in folklore and rich American history. These villages are most famously associated with Washington Irving's 1820 short story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which introduced the world to the character of the Headless Horseman. The tale, set in the post-Revolutionary War era, captured the imagination of readers with its eerie depiction of a haunted village and the ghostly rider who terrorized the countryside. Historically, both villages played important roles in colonial America. The area's historical roots blend with its celebration of Halloween. Sleepy Hollow leans into its ghostly reputation with seasonal festivities like haunted hayrides, cemetery tours, and elaborate displays honoring the Headless Horseman. Tarrytown, with its picturesque charm and colonial past, complements Sleepy Hollow with historic homes and annual fall events. Together, these villages preserve their storied past while embracing their folklore, making them ideal destinations for those seeking history and hauntings. I sat down with Lucia Trainer, the executive director of the Sleepy Hollow Tarrytown Chamber of Commerce. Of course, we keep the conversation cozy and we talk about Halloween and October and all of the fun, iconic things to do in these super festive villages, but we also dedicate a portion of the conversation to preservation, particularly as it pertains to the impact that such a large influx of tourism has on a small historic village. And so I hope you enjoy that portion of the conversation as well. I think it's not talked about enough in a broad setting. So I hope you glean some insight from it and enjoy this conversation. Welcome to Grandma's Silver, where tradition meets today. I'm Allie, your host and the founder of the Grand Millennial Lifestyle. Here, we blend aesthetics with nostalgia, engaging in conversations with lifestyle brands, designers, and more to rediscover the timeless charm of the past. Join me as we journey from home to heart, illuminating the past and polishing the present with the gleam of Grandma's Silver.
Hi, Allie. Thank you for the opportunity to join your podcast. My name is Lucia Trainer. I am a resident of Tarrytown. I've lived here for the past 9 years, and I've been in the role of the executive director of the Sleepy Hollow Tarrytown Chamber of Commerce for a couple of years now. And I do cover both villages, Sleepy Hollow and Tarrytown. And although my role really hasn't been focused on tourism, because it's really about being a liaison with the businesses that are based in both villages, over the past year, I can tell you that at least half of my role in what I do has been taken over by tourists coming here to this area. And I've added to my roles and responsibilities tourism concierge.
So they're considered villages.
Yes, they're both considered villages, and they each have like a population of like 12 to 14,000.
Okay.
And to give you an idea, when we have certain Halloween events, that's how many people come.
Oh,
like
wow.
14,000 people. Yes, from outside of this area.
Oh my gosh. Now, one of the questions I did want to ask you, and we kind of talked about this briefly pre-recording, but Sleepy Hollow, Tarrytown, they're kind of lumped together.
Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and, all of the historic landmarks that are located in Sleepy Hollow, and the fact that we've been promoting events that sort of tie into this legend have led to the surge in tourism and people saying, oh, I'm going to what they're touting as Sleepy Hollow Country. And Sleepy Hollow Country is kind of lumping Sleepy Hollow and Tarrytown and even Cortland Manor, where the Great Jack-o'-lantern event takes place, as sort of Sleepy Hollow Country. But the two villages demographically and what they offer are very distinct, very unique. But when September and October come around, the two villages kind of unite in their offerings. So both Sleepy Hollow and Tarrytown have various locations where, whether it's Washington Irving's residence, temporary residence, or the, headless horseman apparitions by the bridge or other parts. And that kind of unites both villages. And in fact, that's at one point they were both Tarrytown, and then North Tarrytown sort of became Sleepy Hollow.
Okay. Tarrytown is interesting because, of course, as someone who knows Sleepy Hollow based on its association with the legend and the author, Tarrytown was sort of a surprise to me because that's one I don't hear about as frequently. So I'd actually like to start with Tarrytown because I think it helps us to provide a bit more context. I was reading that Irving actually used to live in Tarrytown, and he was very much inspired by the landscape. It's along the Hudson River.
Both villages are united by one history, and the history is the Dutch settlers. And when you go to any of, again, the historic landmarks here, it's all about the Dutch settlers, the American Revolution, and then there's nature. So the majestic Hudson is behind us at all times in both villages. It runs, not through, obviously, but, at the shore of both villages. The nature preserve, Rockefeller State Preserve, which, by the way, is 1,700 acres.
Wow.
It kind of dominates Sleepy Hollow, but it also does go into Tarrytown. And that's a very dominant, not only theme in the legend of Sleepy Hollow, but in this area. If you ask residents, not lifelong residents, but residents who have moved here in the past, I don't know, 10, 20 years, what tourist attractions are not necessarily why we moved here, right? It is the nature. So the Rockefeller Preserve you can't build on it. We're talking, again, 1,700 acres, 55 miles, hundreds of trails that are in a preserve. That to me was key, having the Hudson behind us. And then Tarrytown's been called one of the quaintest villages in the country. What's different about Tarrytown, it's got a very vibrant downtown in terms of shops and restaurants. But again, that's kind of evolved maybe since, the early 2000s. And then Sleepy Hollow, both Sleepy Hollow and Tarrytown, when I, mentioned some of the historic landmarks, including Washington Irving's, residence, is either in Tarrytown or Sleepy Hollow. And the Dutch settlers, Frederick Phillips, he owned all of Westchester. He basically owned all of Westchester, which spans even beyond these villages. The Rockefellers, which, when you talk about mansions in this area, you've got the Rockefellers, those who lived at Lyndhurst, you've got the Octagon House. So you've got people that were very prominent from starting in the late 1700s, all the way to, modern history. And those are kind of the players that dominate this area historically. But I can't tell you that that's the reason why a lot of the residents moved here. It's the nature, it's the quaint villages, it's walkability, and history is definitely part of it. But if you ask many residents haven't even been to the tours that I've been to.
History is funny because I think unless you are very much so a history buff, that tends to not be a driving force for people when they're selecting a locale, but they develop an incredible sense of ownership and stewardship of a place's history once they're there. It's a part of them.
And honestly, the majority of the tours are historic. And so when I get those phone calls that it's just about Halloween and I become that tourist concierge, I'm like, okay, well, what are your interests? Because if it is Halloween inspired events, those typically happen end of September throughout October, and now starting till mid-November. If it's not Halloween inspired, then the majority of the tours are historic, with, again, Washington, Irving kind of at the center, but also the Rockefellers and these other prominent figures whose mansions have tours.
Well, even if we look at Washington Irving's story,
Yes,
that has of course, it's folklore. Much of that developed from a historical event.
exactly.
So it makes sense that, of course, it has spooky vibes and, but that it is actually inspired by history. So the
Correct.
tour would
And
inherently be that way.
and you know what? It's interesting because I tell whoever comes to this area, I say, whether it's you read it or you put it on Audible, start with the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, because a lot of the characters are inspired by actual, folks who lived here. The Headless Horseman was inspired, even though there's different, theories, was inspired by a Hessian soldier from the Revolutionary War. And a lot of the fireside sort of chats and spooky stories, that really happened because of the Revolutionary War. A lot of it stems from the Revolutionary War, which we were in the middle of. So you're right. So there is sort of an intersection of history and then Washington Irving's short stories.
If we start shifting slightly to Washington Irving, one of the reasons that you and I connected was because, of course, Sleepy Hollow notoriously has a connection to October and Halloween festivities. I would be curious to talk a little bit about, and you've somewhat addressed this, but how the town, whether or not we're talking October or not,
Yes.
honors that legacy, or what
Yes.
pride is taken into that legacy.
Yeah. So I think everything changed after COVID.
Yeah.
So prior to COVID, our events here were largely attended by residents. So the Halloween parade, and then, the great jack-o'-lantern, that one, you had more people from just here and the river towns overall. COVID hits, people are looking for, outdoor events, unique events. And literally the Halloween parade again went from, maybe 7,000 attendants from local residents and adjacent river towns to last year, I think we had 14,000. The same thing with the chamber. Every year puts on 2 street fairs, and one of them is the Sleepy Hollow Street Fair. That was actually my first assignment when I joined. And last year also we had about 14,000. But what was interesting is the vendors. So now of the 170 vendors, I would say half of them are coming from all over the country with Halloween inspired arts and crafts. So this has sort of happened organically. And then this year, Sleepy Hollow is celebrating its 150th anniversary. And it's added all these new events, parade, fireworks, and a haunted hayride. The haunted hayride, again, it's been mostly residents. Now it was sold out within a day. It was sold out, and the majority of the people buying those tickets are not necessarily residents. And then you have historic Hudson Valley, and they have, 5 different tourism centers, including the Great Jack-o'-lantern event. They're experiencing, similar situations where already their events for late September, early October are completely sold out. So as much as it's happened kind of organically, I think mostly those tourism centers like historic Hudson Valley, the Historical Society here in Tarrytown, and then Historic Hudson Valley controls, for example, the Phillipsburg Manor Visitor Center. And then you've had Lyndhurst, the Lyndhurst Mansion. they're now kind of jumping on the bandwagon of, okay, let's promote these events more heavily. That's kind of creating, even a more significant increase in people who are now aware and coming to this town. And
Mhm.
also the media, the media's been calling and they're like, oh, top 10 towns to visit. Or so it's honestly, because the infrastructure, we don't have the infrastructure to serve all this tourism surge. We're like, okay, maybe we shouldn't be promoting some of these events the way we have been.
We will talk about that in a moment because you and I had a separate conversation where I think it is important to have this conversation surrounding infrastructure and impact on historic
Yes.
spaces and places. I do want to backtrack just a smidge because you talked a little bit about some of the events that take place both for locals and now visitors. And while we are not necessarily promoting that everyone go out there this year,
Yeah. Yep.
I would like to hear a little bit about what some of those are, particularly those that have been part of the town or villages, not towns,
Yes.
but
Yep.
but that helps to shape, I think, some of the tradition that locals have developed over time.
Sure. So there again, there's some sort of events and traditions that are not necessarily just during the fall, but they're part of the fabric of this area. So even like the Tash Farmers Market, right? So every Saturday, Patriots Park is smack in the middle of both villages. And although it's in Tarrytown, Patriots Park borders Sleepy Hollow. So there's a lot of events where both villages participate that take place at Patriots Park, which is they're going to have parade, and the parade starts at Patriots Park and then it goes to Beekman on along Route 9, which again both villages share, and it goes to Beekman, which is Sleepy Hollow's main street. That particular event, although it's done by the village of Sleepy Hollow officials, I guarantee you it will be, residents for both villages either going or staying away.
Yeah.
But it will impact both, villages. So at Patriots Park every Saturday, you have a farmer's market. That's really important, again, for this community. The Sleepy Hollow Cemetery is probably one of the most visited places in this area. It is, I forget how many acres it is, but it's a huge cemetery. It is active. So, residents and other folks are buried there, but there is a section of the cemetery that, again, you have, Washington Irving, you even have the Hessian soldier, you have the Rockefellers, you have so many prominent figures buried at the cemetery, and they do cemetery tours, again, primarily kind of walking tours that talk about the prominent figures and some historic figures. They also have lantern tours at night. Sleepy Hollow Cemetery is probably one of the most visited. And then the other is Phillipsburg Manor. So that's controlled by Historic Hudson Valley. And Phillipsburg Manor was owned, as I said, by Frederick Phillips. It has a mill, so they used to produce wheat. And they also had like 20 plus enslaved, 21 slaves at the time. And Phillipsburg Manor has a visitor center, and the tours for Kaika, which is the Rockefeller estate, depart from Phillipsburg Manor. Then the Historical Society in Tarrytown has all these walking tours. I mean, there's so many, I don't know how many other, Washington Irving, Sunnyside residents. You have Lyndhurst. Each of these, as I said, tourism centers or areas have their own tours and their own events that they have launched to kind of capitalize on the whole Halloween and ghost stories, all of that. And also you have other events like the Stand Up Paddle Witches Festival, October 13th. Lyndhurst has these like after dark. Jonathan Kruk is a narrator of the Washington Irving's legend. So Lyndhurst hosts these events. The Old Dutch Church, which is prominently featured in Washington Irving's legend, they have readings and they have tours. So there's literally from September, mid-September through, now end of November, you have all sorts of events going on. Even Tarrytown Music Hall has like ghost tours and other events that they do specifically for this time of the year.
Now, I know, especially in your current role, your approach to celebrating the season may look a bit different now. Understanding you shared that you have a long history with Tarrytown in particular, I would love to hear some of your go-to ways to celebrate the season that are part of either your tradition or that you hope able to be preserved and maintained as the towns or villages continue to grow.
My day starts with nature walks. So for me, any of the tours that are walking tours in nature, day or night, are among my favorites. There's one particular one that I'm going to again this year. It's called Hulda's Night. It's a lantern tour. That one's done by the Rockefeller State Preserve folks. It's storytelling, but it's different from other tours where you have tour guides. This one, it's folks that are dressed in sort of the American Revolutionary period. You walk into the Rockefeller State Preserve and they have lanterns, and each of these folks kind of tell the story of what was going on at this time. And then it culminates with an area where supposedly Hulda, this witch who lived in the state preserve during the American Revolution, lived. And it's even immersive, like they get people who are in the tour to kind of say, different things along the route. So that one is one of my favorites. The Sleepy Hollow Cemetery tours also, Sunnyside, going to his grave, doing one of the cemetery tours where they talk about Washington Irving and Sunnyside is, in my opinion, a must after you read it or listen to it. I went a long time ago with my kids to the Great Jack-o'-lantern Blaze. That, as I said, is in Van Cortlandt Manor. So it's about 20-25 minutes from here. But I would say that's one of the top attractions during this time. And if you have kids or even as adults, it's an amazing event that now everybody goes to. It's eliminated, handcrafted jack-o'-lanterns. I don't know, there's probably hundreds or thousands of them. So
that's fun. Of course, infrastructure.
Yes.
When we originally talked, and I am just saying this because I think it's important to provide a bit of context for folks who are listening. So when I originally reached out, of course, it was for the obvious, right? Sleepy Hollow, Halloween. I'm not a big spooky person, so I think it can give you the cozy autumn. And I think it hits on a lot of pillars that folks are looking for this time of the year. And so I originally reached out with more of a tourism interest. But as you and I got to talking, as someone who has worked in preservation, appreciates historic spaces and preservation, it became very clear that this is an important part of the often unspoken. This is not widely talked about outside of the preservation circle.
Yes.
But
yes.
The impact that tourism has, I mean, even on a really broad scale, and this is a very, and bear with me because this is a very big reach, but Chichen Itza, Mexico is an example, right? A lot of these international, national monuments that are now seeing so much foot traffic that they're actually deteriorating, particularly when you see such an influx of unexpected foot traffic and tourism. And so you are in a really challenging position because it's like you want to share, and maybe you can explain this better than I, but your position is tough because you of course want to promote these villages and encourage tourism and appreciation of these villages while also preserving and ensuring future generations can do the same. So
Yes.
I would like to kind of turn this over to you to talk a bit, because of course we're not trying to encourage people not to come see these spaces, but to just raise awareness of the work that then needs to go into ensuring they can.
So going back to the mission of the mission of the chamber is to promote and advocate for local businesses. And you're right. So part of it is when you have this influx of traffic, it's great for the majority of our businesses because restaurants, coffee shops, they all benefit from it. But then on the other side of this coin, you have businesses that provide services or businesses that really rely on local resident traffic. And during these times, what starts to happen is there's so much congestion downtown in both villages that it affects parking, it affects moving around both villages. So you have a lot of the residents that choose during this time to just stay away. So that definitely has an impact on those local businesses that rely on local residents. Also think about the expenses that the village is now undertaking, right? You've got more garbage, you've got more traffic, you have more enforcement, you have to pay enforcement, for weekends. There's all these expenses associated with having tourism. There's even bathroom issues, where tourists are using bathrooms for private businesses that didn't have the infrastructure to serve all these tourists, so they have plumbing issues. Even setting that aside, I'll give you the example of in terms of preservation. So I mentioned that the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery is an active cemetery, right? So you literally, every day you might have a funeral and you have people being buried there. I've witnessed when there's an influx of all these tourists in cars or taking photos, or the impact that it has in the cemetery in those areas where, residents are grieving for their loved ones or burying their loved ones. We have cars that have parked on tombstones. We have crowds that have been celebrating Halloween, drinking and littering. I mean, I hear these stories all the time. And you've got so many, the acreage and it's so expansive that you can't have people monitoring everything every minute. I mean, there's definitely, there's gates, but there's access to the cemetery because it's so many acres and you can access it from different trails. So that's a great example. A lot of the other places, whether it's Sunnyside or Phillipsburg Manor, they are contained. And the, individual folks who handle those areas have sort of, you can't go in without having a ticket, etc. But what's interesting is I've had numerous calls saying, oh my God, nobody's answering my phone calls. And I've been trying to book a tour for 50 people, this and the other. I'm like, these are all nonprofit organizations. They've never been, they've never had to handle this type of foot traffic. They're understaffed. I don't know about, whether it's had impact in terms of the actual preservation of these monuments or sites. But as I said, the cemetery is an example of what has happened with this influx of tourism.
And this raises a couple of different things, right? First and foremost, I think part of it, of course, influx as far as the cemetery goes is certainly a problem in a way. However, it sounds like respect is also a larger issue because, and I would hope folks who are listening to this podcast, we tend to be a fairly like-minded, respectful community, but I can't imagine having or prioritizing my desire to get a picture or see something in person over the desecration of somebody's grave. or the disrespect of a group of grieving, mourning people.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
first and foremost, I think that's not a separate issue because it is creating an impact, but that is a larger, there's a larger issue at play there, unfortunately.
And it's the pack mentality, right? You know, a lot of the folks that are coming are into, you know, this, they're young, they're into this spooky Halloween
Yeah,
culture. They gather, they come together, and yeah, you might lose sense of
where
the
you really
respect
are.
and
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
yeah. Well, hopefully, if anyone is listening, this is your this is your PSA to
Yeah.
tell your friends, your children, everyone you know, what is right and what is wrong. You know, you mentioned too the nonprofits, and I think this is sort of the larger conversation that we're having here is that tourism, particularly when we're talking about historic spaces that are seeing a boon, it's a blessing and a curse.
Yep.
So, of course, those nonprofits are probably so happy to have the business, so happy
Yes.
to have the opportunity to spread their mission and their goals and their programming. But it is a challenge because, like you mentioned, nonprofits are understaffed. They tend to not have many resources, or they have limited capacity or resources. So again, I think that goes to the challenge of just remember where you are and have grace, give grace to folks who are trying to do things. No one is out to give you a bad experience. uh,
Correct. Yes.
yeah. And you were even talking to me on the phone the day that we had our initial phone call. You had just gotten off the phone with a very large bus company.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes.
and you were telling me, you're like, I don't know where to tell this bus to go. Now I need to figure out parking. So did you want to talk
Yep.
about that too? Because this is, again, I think things that whether you are a historic place that wants to perhaps watch what's going on in Sleepy Hollow and Tarrytown and use it as an example of, watch how you're doing things, because I think you're doing as best as job as you can with managing this influx, particularly during such a small window.
Correct.
The other thing, but yeah, I would just love to hear more about some of that from you.
So that's fairly new, you know, having calls from tour companies. And, you know, I always question when they call, I always ask questions like, where are you coming from? Is this something that's new to you, a new offering, etc.? And what I'm hearing is there's a broader theme here again. And what they're saying is post-COVID, you have folks that have increased sort of domestic travel. You know, many of them are not necessarily abroad, and it's more about exploring all these villages or towns or cities in the US. And what's interesting is it prompted these like one-day tours. A lot of these tour buses are coming from Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, most recently. They either stop here and head to Salem, or go to Salem and then stop here. And they're like, what can we do, in a day or two, a day or two, some of them even a few hours. It's like, oh, we're only going to be there a few hours. What would you do? And where do we park? So, we'll go there for the day and we'll park somewhere and drop off folks. Where do we park? Just that is a challenge, because parking is a challenge to begin with when you have the surge in tourism. And again, you have the Tarrytown train station as an example, which is a commuter station, but also we encourage a lot of people to park at the train station and come here, is not usually serving entire buses. If you look at the sources of revenue for villages, by the way, towns, parking is usually the top 5 parking income streams, right? So charging for parking, but also there's parking and for, there's budget, but there's also, again, expenses associated with parking, such as parking enforcement. When you have these buses that are taking up all these parking spaces,
Yeah.
it has a, an impact on the parking real estate, and then also parking revenue. But also think about, okay, if people can't find parking downtown or in these areas, they start spilling into residences, like, resident areas. So
Yeah.
the parking issue is a huge issue for most villages that are experiencing, any sort of increased traffic, and especially with tourism. The DPW, the, Public Works, when they do their job on the weekends, you're talking about they get paid overtime. So all
Yeah.
of this is an economic burden on the villages. And the villages don't do these tours. The villages don't collect sales taxes from people shopping. The villages usually don't have porta potties, right?
Right.
During this time, now they're having to not only rent porta potties, but have them serviced. All of these expenses have not been budget items in the budgets of villages and towns.
Have you had conversations with any, I mean, you mentioned Salem, which just kind of made me think about this. Have you had conversations with other villages in similar situations to yours?
I can tell you that I haven't had conversations, but our village officials and others have had conversations. They're going through the same thing.
Yeah.
I mean, they're going through the same thing. And then you hear even, I mean, I just heard a story in Barcelona. In Barcelona, they're like spraying tourists. There's
What?
like spraying them. Yes.
With
Like
what?
residents are like spraying tourists with like either water or paint, whatever, just to say like stay away,
Oh
stay
my
away.
gosh. I'm laughing
There's
because
others.
it's so bizarre, but that is unfortunate.
Yeah, there's
Like
others
that.
that are imposing in Venice. I heard they were imposing a tourism kind of tax. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I think we definitely are open to looking at different models to not to offset the
Right.
expenses, because all of a sudden what you're going to have is you're going to have the residents saying, why are my taxes increasing? Why am I paying for this when
Mhm.
I didn't ask for it? So I think we're going to have to, start looking at other models. Also the messaging. So the messaging for the Halloween, for the Halloween parade, that I'm honestly scared of this year, the Halloween parade. If last year we had over 14,000 people, we're already seeing numbers in websites, number of calls, tourism increase before the timeline that they would come last year, and the calls regarding the Halloween parade. So I'm really scared. So we're telling folks, take the train, park in other river towns, park in the city, and take the train, because otherwise you will not be able to leave this village for hours.
And everyone experiences this, particularly in situations like yours, that there are learning curves. You can't always please everyone right away. I mean, parking is not an overnight issue that will be remedied, but you are at least having the foresight to give them the warning.
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, that's
yeah.
one of the best things you can do. So,
That's
yeah.
exactly it. The
Oh,
messaging.
man.
Yep.
Now, I did want to ask, because of course, understanding the impact and the infrastructure and the challenges there, what historic integrity atmosphere are you hoping can, or from your own perspective, would you hope is preserved or maintained?
For me, it's interesting. Again, if you had asked me 9 years ago, why are you moving to Tarrytown and Sleepy Hollow? None of these, none of what we've been discussing was really among the factors that I consider. For me, it's a beautiful village. As I said, nature. When I moved here, nature became an important part of my life. Safety, walkability. 4 or 5 years, it's when I mean, I've reread The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. I've listened to it, and I'm like, oh my God, I feel like as much as a lot has changed since the 1800s, so much of the history, the nature, sort of because nature is a big part of this village, but the history, the storytelling of, the fireside chats, all of this have sort of come alive in the past couple, that's what this has, at least for me, sort of done, is everything, all that history, all those stories have come alive. And I feel like I'm moved here for the first time, rediscovering all of this. So for me, these legends and the fact that all these historic landmarks are creating events to tell the story over and over of these villages and what happened here, and Washington Irving's short stories. For me, that's what I hope continues, is that awareness of just how rich the history is in this area.
And then as far as the future, particularly in your role, what hopes do you have for the experiences of locals and visitors?
Balance, right? In my role, it's really the success of the businesses. It's like, how do we continue to capitalize on this growth and this success, but maintain sort of that, when you talk about preservation, to, not at the detriment of these historic sites and historic monuments.
Very well said.
The only landmark that I failed to, the two landmarks that I failed to mention are the lighthouse and what is now called the Mario Cuomo Bridge. And those are just so iconic, but it's because it's what many visitors visit when they come here, but I didn't mention those. But I mean, the Mario Cuomo Bridge is honestly a whole controversial topic. So the Dutch settlers called the widest part of the Tappan Zee, the widest part of the Hudson, they named it Tappan Zee, which Tappan was from the natives that lived in this area, and Zee is the Dutch word for sea. And the bridge was called the Tappan Zee Bridge for many years, and it was rebuilt. I don't know the dates, but it's very recent that the bridge was rebuilt, and it was named the Mario Cuomo Bridge, against the wishes of the majority, if not all, of the residents of this area. It's a beautiful bridge. It's 3.5 miles, and it goes from Tarrytown across to Rockland. You can walk on the bridge. There's these viewing platforms. It's beautiful, but it's, again, the name change is highly controversial. And then on the Riverwalk, which has been, talk about infrastructure, the Westchester County has spent millions of dollars on renovating the lighthouse and the river, extending the Riverwalk. So when tourists come here, I always tell them, make sure you go on the Riverwalk. You can actually walk by the bridge all the way to Phillips Manor in Sleepy Hollow and beyond. And there's a beautiful lighthouse that was recently renovated there. So most people who come to this area do visit those two landmarks.
Okay. This was very enlightening. So thank you very much. I will, of course, make sure that in our show notes, I post, all the links for people to follow the chamber. I believe you're on Instagram, and
yes,
they can follow along. I'll make sure your website is linked in there, because of course we are talking about the fall season, but there is so much going on year round. Be sure to check out the calendar. Well, thank you very, very much for taking the time.
You're welcome.